Communications and Engagement Officer at Right to Protest, Omhle Ntshingila, expands on this. Good morning, Omhle. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Good morning, Ms. Chava. Thank you for inviting me to come speak to you guys on the show today.
Omhle, as we celebrate Freedom Day, how do you think that the nature of protests has evolved since the apartheid era? And what are some key differences in the issues being addressed?
I think what's interesting about our history is that Freedom Day cannot be celebrated without the right to protest. It's actually protest action that led us to this day. It's not counted how many protests actually happened under apartheid for us to actually enjoy the freedoms that we have and to enjoy the right to vote, because we all know that all the rights that we enjoy under our constitution, the gateway to that right has been the right to protest. And protest still remains a cornerstone of our constitution. It still remains a cornerstone of our democracy. And although that protests are now happening under a democracy, it's because of, due to various reasons that are happening under our constitution, due to service delivery, due to a breakdown of communication between citizens and its own government. And we find ourselves having 27 protests a day because of those relations in our country.
Would you say that protests are still an effective means of bringing about change in modern-day South Africa?
I think most of the time when we think about protest, we want to think about alternatives, but there isn't an alternative to the Constitution. The right to protest will always be relevant, no matter what time or day it is, no matter even if it's today or within the next 50 years. Communities must be able to hold governments accountable and to also show dissent and frustrations in the ways and the tools that are available to them. I think when people think about protest, they only think about marching or being on the streets, but protest varies in its many different ways. And our constitution also lays this out very well, that protests are not only just demonstrations, they are also petitions. So protests are still very relevant in our country, and they should always be relevant in our country because governments and corporates must be held accountable, and communities must be able to express themselves about the living conditions and their economic conditions in our country in ways that are available to them. And so because the Constitution lives and is the cornerstone of our democracy, so is the right to protest still relevant in our country.
What impact do detractors or even criminal elements have on the right to protest? I mean, we looked at what was happening during COVID-19 as well as the looting that occurred over the period that some people were protesting for Jacob Zuma.
Unfortunate situations that lead to such elements and to violence during protests. It's because that protesters do not get their memorandums answered in times. They do not get their demands met in time also. And because of the level of corruption, the level of lack of service delivery in our country, this culminates and is compounded by other things that happen in our society, like people who take political opportunities to use genuine frustration coming from communities with their own political agendas. I think what we should be looking at the most is that why is service delivery in our country still so slow? Why is addressing apartheid legacies such as disparities between those who have and those who don't have still such a drag? And why is government's response to frustrations and to genuine community demands and cries still going at such a snail's pace? Because this lack of frustration and the lack of response from governments to solve and resolve issues in our country, such as GBV, safety in communities, this all culminates to huge frustration because no community just wakes up and burns a tire. Our nature as South Africans is always to engage in dialogue first because of our cultural structure. We always engage in dialogue first. But when dialogue is met with police brutality, private security brutality, it leaves communities no choice but to use the only language in which which governments and corporates know, and that is violence. And that is very unfortunate. And it's something that the government should take accountability in addressing urgently in our country.
Omhle, speaking of the government, you've also mentioned that violence by the police or security is often not covered in the media, and the disproportionate use of force is hardly ever addressed. What role do you think the police's use of force plays in escalating or de-escalating tension during protests?
We've seen as the right to protest, and we've also recorded this in our state of protest address, is that the violence and the brutality that we see on the ground really is a form of intimidation towards protesters and their frustrations and expressing their right to protest, but also expressing their dissent. This contributes so much to the frustrations on the ground during protest action when police use excessive force and not engage in other tools and interventions in which they are trained to do before they even release or de-escalate situations or release any sort of bullets or enforce any sort of force. Police not wanting to use peaceful interventions to speak to protesters, to negotiate, contributes to the high protest-related deaths that we've seen and protest-related injuries that we've seen that really go unreported, that really go equated also in courts where police have not been held accountable. Till today, Marikana is still an issue. It's still a national question that still needs to be answered. But also many other questions, as we've seen the high intolerance of protest in our country with the recent Wusu protest, where a student has died because of this sort of violence. So it's very important for the police to not only address their own inequities and just lack of care when it comes to protest action, but it's also important that government intervenes because protest-related deaths and injuries are real in our country. They are increasing by the day, and this shouldn't be happening under our democracy.
My next question was actually about Marikana. What do you think are the key lessons that can be taken away from that tragic incident?
I think the key lessons here is that demands of communities are real. They are not this fairy tale that government or corporates make up. But what we can take from Marikana is that as the miners were willing to engage with the mine and the state, but the state and the corporate decided to respond in violence. And that turned out to be a tragedy that not only left communities traumatized with this violence, but also left so many people losing their loved ones. It shouldn't be something that happens again. Governments should try by all means to prevent such situations from ever happening again, to prevent the use of live ammunition, other lethal weaponry, but to also prevent the loss of life. Anyone's life in South Africa is highly important, and it's essential that our governments and our courts go by all means, use all peaceful interventions to ensure the protection of the right to life and that lives shouldn't be lost during protest action.
Omhle, we've seen protests such as the #FeesMustFall movement, where students have been fighting for affordable education and access to quality education. How would you say this protest has impacted the country's education system?
This has been going on for quite a years. This year is 10 years of Fees Must Fall. Since Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall happened in our country. And 10 years later, students are still demanding the same things those students were demanding years ago. And with this protest action, what we see is that students are not only just highlighting the lack of efficiencies that are happening within their campus, but they are actually highlighting what's happening in society. And students unfortunately bear the brunt of energy when it comes to showing dissent and when it comes to showing dissatisfaction about the status quo in our country. It is very important that government really revisits how they respond to student protests, but also how universities themselves respond to student discourse. Student discourse should never be displaced from the campus. campus. Students have the right to protest even on campus. They have the right to show their dissent on campus. And it's important that the Department of Higher Education rails in the violence that we are seeing on campuses, across all campus, and the use of private security who have no jurisdiction at all to be at protest on campuses. It's important that accountability is seen in higher education, it's seen in the police, in public order policing, and the government itself as a whole when it comes to responding to genuine student issues on campuses.
And Omhle, you once mentioned that some municipalities have attempted to charge for protests, but this action has been unsuccessful. Tell us, how have municipalities approached protest regulations since then? And have you seen a shift in municipalities' approaches to protest regulations?
As the right to protest, we always say that working with governments is very important, and it's crucial to us, no matter which tier of government it is. And what we've seen after the practice of the city of Johannesburg was found unconstitutional by the Johannesburg High Court is that we have seen a compliance from some of these municipalities who have really found a way to work well with communities, work well with social movements when it comes to giving notice, inquiring about what the issues are before they even release any force, but also working together to give access to the right to protest to municipalities. But we've also found some municipalities who've taken this judgment as punishment, and who have sought to also punish those who want to protest in communities by not allowing people to give notice, but not allowing people to have protection during their protest actions, and by intimidating protesters even further by increasing municipal barriers that don't allow people to give notice, that really dissuade and discourage people from protesting in their communities. But as the right to protest, we are monitoring this.
Yeah, let's expand on that a little bit more. What implications does the Regulation of Gathering Act of 1993 have on the right to protest, particularly in relation to the requirement for notice and potential restrictions on gathering?
As I said previously, is that our nature as South Africans is to create dialogue, is always to engage in dialogue. And the Regulations Gatherings Act assists us. It's a framework that gives us how to protest within our legal frameworks as well. But it also gives rights and responsibilities not only just to the protester, but it also gives rights and responsibilities to the police. It gives rights and responsibilities to the municipality, to ensure that the right to protest in communities is realized. There's access to the right to protest, but there's also access to safety for protesters. And that also municipalities or corporates who memorandums are handed to respond to memorandums within the timeframes that is given within the Regulations Gatherings Act.
What do we have to say, Omhle, when lives are lost, as we've seen in previous protests, during protest action?
This also is really not just something the right to protest is concerned about, but we've just seen so many lives being lost across the African continent and across the world due to intolerance of protest. And we really do believe this is one of the reasons, is because protests have been given a very bad narrative, not only in media, but also by the states in how they educate communities about protests, how they educate communities about the history and the importance of protest action. But we've also seen how also the police have really responded to protest protesters, which has been so unfortunate in our country. And as a country, we should be mourning the loss of the life of the students at WUSU, Sisanda Mbolegwa. And it should be a concern. South Africa shouldn't be quiet about such issues, because a young life loss really is really a disadvantage to our own country and to our continent. And that life could have led to so much greatness and potential for our country as a whole.
Omhle, looking ahead, and very briefly, what do you think are some key issues that will be at the forefront of protests in South Africa? And what challenges do you believe will ignite the passions of the people and drive them to demand change in the coming years?
Now that we've received political freedom, given, the history around Freedom Day, as I said, the still pace of answering and resolving apartheid legacies in our country really, really, really is increasing protest by the day. But it's more of the social breakdown between the government and citizens. The more the government does not respond effectively, does not listen to its own people, this will increase protest action, and not just protest action that we've been seeing in our country that is very spontaneous, but mass protest action. And it's important that government, when that protest action does come, because it cannot be prevented, is ready to engage, but is also ready to respond in a way that is effective, that is peaceful towards its people, but that is also influential for the years to come, and resolve some of the issues. And we see improvements in the living conditions of our people.
Omhle, in closing, as we celebrate Freedom Day, what message do you think is most important for South Africans to remember about the value of protest and activism in our democracy?
I think I would love to really say to our South Africans and everyone living under our constitution that the right to protest is an available tool that should be used for us to improve not only our individual lives, but the lives of the collective. This is a tool of activism that should be used to defend our democracy, to defend our rights, but to also defend the future of the youth that they must enjoy fully as citizens of this country.
Omhle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
That was Communications and Engagement Officer at Right to Protest.